You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 25th of April 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, China and the US explore the health of relations as Secretary of State Antony Blinken holds talks in Beijing. We'll look at the constant, dangerous yo-yoing between the two countries. Also ahead, as the UN warns the situation in Haiti is catastrophic, we ask how much further are they to establishing any kind of transitional council. Spain's Prime Minister steps away from public duties as his wife faces an inquiry. We'll ask, is this the beginning of a surprise end for Pedro Sanchez? And
the aspirations across the board, across geographies are the same. Wanting to be productive, wanting to have freedoms, wanting to have opportunities and wanting to have the skills to contribute.
We head to the European Parliament for a fashion exhibition that challenges perceptions of migrants in the region. And, or should I say,
the growth has been fairly organic, thanks to the fans and to the music industry of the Spanish-speaking countries as well, because even the Spanish-speaking countries, they are consuming more of their own music.
Fernanda Augusto Pacheco tells us why Spanish-language music is dominating the world's music charts. Plus the newspapers and the business headlines too. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. The US President Joe Biden has signed into law a package worth tens of billions of dollars in military aid for Ukraine. Russia has vetoed a US-drafted United Nations Security Council resolution that called on countries to prevent an arms race in outer space. And the government in Slovakia has approved plans to abolish the country's state broadcaster, leading to fears for the independence of the media. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, just what is the state of the relationship between the two most powerful nations on Earth? The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Beijing for talks with China's senior figures at a volatile moment between the two countries. That said, since when have things been stable? Well, I'm joined now by Patricia Thornton, Associate Professor in the Politics of China at the University of Oxford. Welcome back. Good morning, Patricia.
Good morning, Emma.
So do we know what's happened and what's been said yet?
We don't have much information as of yet. Anthony Blinken landed yesterday in Shanghai. It was widely observed that there was no red carpet and no major greeting. He was not met by any large delegation, but instead only by the Shanghai Foreign Affairs Department heads. So it was a very muted beginning to a 3-day trip. He will begin having talks in Beijing tomorrow, official talks with his counterpart Wang Yi in the foreign ministry. So the substantive talks have not yet begun.
Tell us a little bit more about what he hopes to achieve with this one, because by all accounts, US officials say that in most discussions here, the Chinese are incredibly highly disciplined and they all turn the page at the same time and there's no deviation from the message.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Blinken will be facing a really steep upward hill climb when he gets to Beijing. There was a phone call between Xi Jinping and President Biden earlier this month in which Xi Jinping had outlined 3 issues. He warned that the U.S. was not de-risking, or he warned against further de-risking. And he said that any further restrictions on trade with China was going to, in fact, do the opposite, was going to create more risk. Secondly, Xi Jinping wanted Biden to commit to not supporting Taiwan independence, and not just verbally, but with actions as well. Because, of course, we have a new president in Taiwan, and he's considered to be pro-independence by the Chinese government. He will be inaugurated next month, and so Xi Jinping's quite worried about that. And then there was also some discussion about China's support for Russia. But on all 3 of those different issues, yesterday was a very very big day in the United States because, as you mentioned, Biden signed this new military spending bill, which threatens at least two of those major points.
Indeed.
So,
The money for Taiwan. I do apologise for interrupting you, Patricia. Yeah. The money for Taiwan. What effect does this have? Because for the last few weeks there have been tentative suggestions that things have calmed down a little bit when it comes to China's stance on Taiwan. It hasn't been overtly military aggressive.
That's true, but there have been increasing patrols. There's been a lot of aggression in the South China Sea, and in particular, various engagements with the Philippines. So it does look as though the South China Sea has been heating up. And although the $8 billion US dollars in military aid that is part of this new bill is targeted more broadly at securing and countering Chinese threats, but also securing freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and in the Asia Pacific more generally. Obviously, Beijing came out very hard against this, with China's Taiwan Affairs Office calling it a serious violation of U.S. commitments, and that it was sending the wrong signal to Taiwan independent forces, and in fact creating a more dangerous situation in the South China Sea. So this is a lot of, very difficult language, very, very fiery language. So, and Blinken is going to have to contend with that when he gets to Beijing.
And the issue of Russia as well. I mean, when we talk about the money that's been sent to Ukraine, how dependent on China is Russia when it comes to all this? Let's introduce Moscow into the discussion. And,
yes.
And how much is Beijing prepared to capitalize on Russia's increasing dependence on Russia?
So this puts China in a really difficult situation because Xi Jinping is planning a visit to Europe in early May, and it's a bit of a charm offensive because obviously China's economic growth has slowed, and so Xi Jinping and China more generally is trying to maintain good trade relations with the EU. But insofar as the U.S. is now committed to $61 billion in military aid for the Ukraine, this looks like a very difficult situation, and China is now in the crosshairs. Very interestingly, about 2 weeks ago, a well-known professor at Beijing University published an article in the English language media, in The Economist, claiming that basically Russia is sure to lose the war in Ukraine, and that China's relations with Russia are not fixed. And in that article, he suggested that Beijing had edged away from the no-holds-barred friendship that Xi Jinping had previously expressed. So, and that's obviously an unofficial introduction into this debate, but it was a very, very interesting and noteworthy one that a lot of people have been talking about on Chinese social media.
Finally, Patricia, looking at the sort of secondary relationship, given the fact that actually business still has to happen with these two countries. We do know that Antony Blinken has called on China to treat US businesses fairly. But how much is the private sector pivotal to keeping stability between these two nations?
Yeah, so the other big development yesterday, of course, was that President Biden signed this bill, putting a ban basically on TikTok in the United States. TikTok is one of the fastest growing apps in the world, where you have about 170 million users in the US. And President Biden, citing national security concerns and concerns over the data of US users, has signed a bill giving TikTok 270 days, or about 9 months, to divest, meaning that it must sell to a US-based owner. Obviously, China is very much against this because it would mean surrendering control over TikTok's very, very successful algorithms. So that's yet another series of concerns that Blinken is going to have to be addressing in Beijing. I don't envy him one bit.
Patricia Thornton, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. You're listening to Monocle Radio. It's 9:09 in Jerusalem, 7:09 here in London. The UN Human Rights Chief says he's horrified by the destruction of Gaza's two main hospitals amid reports of mass graves being found at the sites. Palestinian officials say they've exhumed the bodies of at least 300 people at Nasser and Al-Shifa hospitals. Meanwhile, support and aid is still being sent to Gaza. The help is coming from all sources, but is it getting through and is it helping? Well, let's hear now from Shayna Lowe from the Norwegian Refugee Council, who joins us on the line from Jerusalem. A very good morning to you, Shayna.
Good morning to you.
Just explain to us a little bit more about what's this discovery of these bodies at Nasser and Al-Shifa hospital. The IDF has denied that they buried bodies, but what do we know?
Well, what we know, and we haven't had staff present, so what we're hearing is what the UN and others are reporting. But what we're hearing is that hundreds of bodies have been found at these hospitals after weeks and weeks of fighting and destruction at these hospitals. The Israelis are claiming that they exhumed bodies that had already been buried, searching for the hostages, but it really is unclear at this point. And the most important thing is to allow for an impartial, independent investigation to go and reach Gaza and uncover what actually is going on. But as you likely know, independent investigators have not been allowed access into Gaza and have been unable to not only investigate these scenes for potential war crimes, but scenes throughout the Gaza Strip. And the scenes from
throughout the Gaza Strip indicate a continuation of an absolute humanitarian catastrophic situation.
Absolutely. We are still struggling to meet people's basic needs. There has been a slight increase in the amount of aid coming in, but it's nowhere near the level that we need to be able to provide for people. We feel that this ground operation in Rafah could happen very, very soon, and we simply have not been able to stockpile the materials necessary to help and assist people who will likely be forced to flee should that ground operation happen. The reason we haven't been able to stockpile is because the needs are simply so great now that we can't withhold aid for people who are desperate today in order to give it to the people who are desperate tomorrow. There just simply is not enough aid getting through. We continue to call for an increase of aid to be coming through the ground crossings that already exist and for a massive scaling up of humanitarian assistance.
Is the ability to get aid through easing at all?
You know, there's been some increase in aid, but I don't want to make it sound like all of a sudden there are solutions that are working. There's still not enough aid getting in. There's not enough aid getting in through the north. There has been some limited aid that's been coming in recently through northern Gaza, but it's nowhere near enough to meet the basic needs. And while we've spent a lot of time counting trucks, what we really need to be looking at is the amount of aid, the tonnage of aid that is coming in, because some of these trucks are very, very small that are being counted and being seen as an increase in aid when in fact it might not be.
There are two things that are happening from the part of the United States. Is this giant floating dock that's being built as well? I mean, how helpful is that going to be? Because there are questions being raised about how much Israel is now co-opting the plan for this enormous this pier to be used as a means to get aid in. But also we've seen the United States allocating a significant amount of money to helping with the humanitarian efforts this weekend. What is the effect of those two issues?
Well, with this floating dock, this pier, obviously it still is not operational. It sounds like it's close to completion, but there are still questions about who's going to be handling the logistics and where exactly it's going to be, and who's going to be reaching that aid. Initially, it was thought that this aid would be able to provide greater access to northern Gaza. It seems like it's going to likely be below the checkpoints and might be used instead as an alternative to the Rafah and Kerem Shalom crossings in the south, should a Rafah offensive happen and those crossings be inaccessible for aid agencies. And so what we're worried is that this could lead to this won't be in addition to the crossings that exist, but an alternative, and that we will not be able to scale up the aid that we so desperately have been calling for nearly 7 months now. In terms of the allocation of billions of dollars of U.S. assistance for humanitarian aid, it's important that aid be made available immediately to Palestinians. I believe that the law was a bit ambiguous in the appropriation of who exactly that humanitarian assistance was for and who it would be going to. And of course, but of course, we need any aid and assistance that we can get in through any means possible at this point.
What sense is there that the international community is acting as one, either in its delivery of the right amount of aid, but also in its coordination of it?
Well, humanitarian agencies are continuing to work together, cooperate together through the UN cluster systems. There have been reports of some agencies that have been kind of empowered to work in parallel to that structure, which is difficult because it makes it difficult to make sure that we're reaching all the people who need to be reached and not duplicating efforts. In terms of the international community, I think that there still is a need for people to be for the international community to be coalescing and united as one in pressuring Israel to allow for an increase of aid and to allow humanitarian access and ensure that humanitarians who are risking their lives to deliver life-saving aid to Palestinians are protected when doing that.
And tell us a little bit about what the effect of the IDF's bombing of an aid convoy in Gaza run by World Central Kitchen has been, because we saw 7 aid workers being killed on the 14th of April, and it massively brought into focus the difficulties faced by everybody trying to help.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the targeting of the World Central Kitchen convoy on April 1st, I think, was a wake-up call for much of the international community. But for those of us who are working on the ground, this was not a surprise. Already around 200 humanitarians had already been killed during the previous 6 months of war. And so for us, it actually, while it was shocking to see an international convoy and particularly an organization that had purportedly been having successful coordination with Israeli authorities be targeted, it just, for us, underscored the risks that we are taking every day and the need for agencies to be planning very carefully and making sure that we're doing all that we can to not put our staff at risk.
Shayna Lowe, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Jerusalem. You're listening to The Globalist live on Monocle Radio with me, Emma Nelson.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
7:18 here in London. Let's have a look now at today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio is Steve Crawshaw, author, journalist, formerly Human Rights Watch UK director, and a man with plenty of papers to talk about. He's brought notes, ladies and gentlemen. How are you, Steve?
I do that. I'm very nervous. I have my comfort blanket. There's never actually time to look at the notes, but I do like to have notes thinking if it came to it. And then, of course, I wouldn't be able to find the notes.
It's the whole thing. It's the net under the tightrope, isn't it?
It's very psychological.
Yes, it is. Just trust
nice to be here.
Trust your brain, Steve. Right, okay. I'll tell everybody if you're listening. I'll let you know if he's reading his notes in a minute. Right, let's start off with Ukraine. That's one story that you wanted to talk to us. There's an article in The Guardian that you want to draw our attention to.
There is. There's obviously lots going on now in the papers. There's two things. We've had the big news this week of the 60 billion finally getting through from America to Ukraine, and then continuing attacks by the Russian forces, obviously, at the same time. I was interested, which was very much timed with this latest announcement and arrival, but The Guardian has an interview with the foreign minister, the Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, and it's really interesting what he and the others are doing, very much spinning the whole thing positively. Well, they're right to be positive, but on the one hand, you see two different narratives. On the one hand, they're saying, we need more, you need to believe, but crucially, he is delivering this narrative of, if you believe in us, we can do this. Because I think what the Ukrainians, I was there most recently in October, but it's changed very much over the months. More and more they're worried that the West is losing faith. And if they lose faith, then they won't give. So they need to create the sense of like, we can do it. And Kuleba's interview is all about that.
It is all about that. And the way that he frames it is a call on the West and the fear that or he says the West has to realise the era of peace in Europe is over, because it is still so easy to compartmentalise crises, given the fact of what is happening all around the world, that you can say, well, we will deal with Ukraine, and it's not an isolated issue, it's a European one.
I think that's exactly right, and it's the Ukrainians' obsession, quite rightly, that people are inclined to go, it's really complicated over there, maybe we just kind of leave them to it, or wouldn't it be nice if they just stopped, not realising that this is very much, they do see themselves, it's gone way beyond 1938 Czechoslovakia, of course, because they've had so much horror in the meantime. But that sense that this is the issue of the whole world. And I think people are beginning to wake up to that a bit, but that's not a battle that's been won for sure.
Let's talk about what's happening at Colombia and the role of peaceful protests. You've got the London Review of Books, which is we haven't had on the newspaper review for a while, so a welcome return, London Review of Books. Thanks for bringing us that. But tell us the story.
I'm happy to have London Review of Books, although actually the one I'd particularly focus on actually is something in the, I propaganded it on this programme before, but the Haaretz, the liberal Israeli paper, such an interesting paper. It's got something interesting. So London Review of Books is more familiar territory in a sense for Western European readers, is talking about the problems that are now faced, and quite rightly identifying those, how it's no good in the old world, which was until only a few months ago, you could criticize somebody in America for not being sufficiently pro-Israel, and they ended up out. And that was the problem. That's happened at Colombia as well. That's now flipped very much. So the protesters who are pro-Palestinian, the head of the college has tried to clamp down. She's now being blamed for letting it out of control, but she's very much against them. And it's about that sense of that changed narrative, which I think is absolutely there. It'll be important in this US election now. It's the first time that we're seeing it. And obviously the horror, the twin horrors that we've seen, on the one hand, what happened on 7th of October, and on the other hand, what's happened in the six months or however long it is since then, is dividing America and the world in very, very different ways. And what I wanted to pick up from the Haaretz one, which I thought was really interesting, the writer there in Haaretz is saying there are two completely different narratives, and people never join up these narratives. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights a few months ago used the great phrase of tribalized pain that we must get away from. You're interested in one or the other. And she has she concludes her piece with interesting, we can't understand what's going on until we realise that no, this isn't a literal Nazi rally. In other words, that the pro-Israel camp are kind of demonising the protesters. And no, the justice of a cause, in other words, the pro-Palestinian cause, doesn't mean you can excuse bigotry within it or deny its existence. And I do think that's a real thing, is that people are looking at the pain of one lot. In that case, they're not interested in what's happened there, and vice versa. I think we need to confront that more than we have done.
There is an article in the Financial Times which sort of uses examples to explain the bigger problem that you have just talked about, which is the fact that we have this, and it's on the front page of the FT this morning, these green tented protests in Colombia, which Colombia, the university, not Colombia, the country, the students are holding a Gaza solidarity encampment at Columbia University, saying that they will stay until companies that profit from Israel, including Microsoft, Boeing and GE, would no longer have a financial interest in Colombia, that they needed the university to divest interest from those companies, which is all well and good. But then you have this secondary item that Jewish students are being targeted on campus.
Exactly.
And they are scared.
Yes.
And it's that whole, as you say, the tribal, was it the tribalism of suffering?
Yes.
That what you cannot do is there's a failure to humanise here.
It is extraordinary, and we're seeing it in Europe, we're seeing it in North America, that people are going like, well, this is what me and my gang are most concerned about, and I'm not really interested in listening to what you're. And I was very conscious of it when I was in Israel quite recently. Obviously, a troubled place, Israel, Palestine, Israel and the occupied territories, obviously troubled place since forever, so to speak. But now everybody says that since 7th of October, those organizations who worked really closely together, Palestinians and Israelis, are finding themselves fracturing because they're retreating into, well, do you not care about what happened on that day? Or do you not care what's happening now? So as you say, you're getting... And depending on your tribe, you are more upset about Islamophobia or you're more upset about anti-Semitism. But I think it needs to be understood that both of those groups are feeling that real. And I think that Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein, who I quoted, the UN Human Rights Commissioner, a brilliant Jordanian, that sense of the tribalism of pain, everybody needs to wake up to that. It's so important.
And the difficulty that people are facing is that, even Joe Biden might have sort of stepped slightly wrong here. He issued a statement on Sunday ahead of Passover saying blatant anti-Semitism is reprehensible and dangerous. This is not necessarily an issue of anti-Semitism. This is a problem with Israel that people are having, and they are two separate things in many ways.
Yes, although, of course, you also have both. That's where it gets so complicated. I think any politician needs to tread very, very carefully. A lot of people are very concerned about Israel and what it has been doing, quite rightly. I think the Haaretz piece is interesting in saying don't deny the fact that within that group there is a subset who are saying these things. And so each group slightly is group grasping for that subset. It's incredibly challenging. My optimistic bit, which is feeling pretty battered at the moment, I have to say, but my optimistic bit would be that old cliche of darkness before the light, that things are so bad at the moment that at some point people will step back and go like, okay, we need to address this more broadly.
Let's move to, you're talking about sensitivities and political comment just there. Let's talk about the way that the rest of the world has seen the British government's plan to send migrants to Rwanda. This is an issue which is clearly very, very connected with France because it is where all these boats are setting off from. But this idea of sending immigrants who arrive illegally in the United Kingdom for processing in Rwanda has the whole of Europe is looking at it as well by saying, actually, is this the way that we want things to go? But it's come under intense scrutiny internationally.
It really has. So it's come under a lot of scrutiny in Britain. It started, the government, when they started selling it, they thought they had a free pass. They thought that they were, look, we're being really tough, and that seemed to play electorally well. It's gone much worse in the meantime. As you say, I was interested, so all of the European papers have been covering this, and usually with a very raised eyebrow. The British government keeps saying, without very much evidence to see it's really true, but keeps claiming that others are looking to Britain as an example to follow. Although we haven't really, apart from places like Hungary, which are a bit of an outlier, we haven't really seen I think we've seen more scepticism. Le Monde quite rightly makes the point saying the Tories are counting on the bill to reverse the electoral power dynamic ahead of Britain's general election, which comes in the autumn or coming later this year, and then says rather dryly, the opposition Labour Party currently has a 20-point lead in voting intentions. And I think that sense of this all being about an election, it's so cynical because actually none of these things may in fact be able to be achievable properly in any case. But I was interested by the Times, not a super conservative paper, but certainly wouldn't see itself as being on the liberal side. They have very prominently reported a new Refugee Council report that comes out today, timed, of course, for the Rwanda bill, which finally went through after much protest by the House of Lords, much more protest than would usually be seen. They pushed back again and again. So today's headline in the Times is migrant laws to put 115,000 in limbo at the cost of £17 million a day. This is basically saying, what are you actually trying to gain by that? And the fact that you've got that so prominently in the Times, not only in the Times, a kind of sense that the government doesn't really know what's doing. So what was supposed to be playing in the government's favour for the elections has now slightly, I think, become one of like, you don't really know what you're doing.
It's taken it a bit too far and can't go back. Finally, anybody who watched any news yesterday will have been confronted by the astonishing images of several military horses going bananas in London. It was an amazing image, and it prompted a big discussion in the Nelson household last night, actually, because these horses were out on exercise in Hyde Park in the centre of the city. They were outside Hyde Park. They were spooked by some construction noises, and they bolted. And there then ensued this enormous sort of chase across town. But the trouble is that not only did the horses like bump into things and knock people over, and horse and riders were injured as they were thrown from their horses. One of the horses was absolutely covered in blood and was clearly seriously injured. And one section of the Nelson household thought this was a brilliant picture story. And the other section of the Nelson household thought, actually, this is a seriously injured horse. Let's not put blood-covered pictures of it running around London. Stunning pictures, albeit that they were. Where do you lie on this one, Steve?
So I'm not going to call you out on the divisions of where which parties you were, but I think I was reflecting on this. I think I'm with both sides of your household, really. So, but my first instinct goes, former journalist myself, but I think actually many of us like, whoa, what an image. I mean, it absolutely, and I don't know whether some of the most brilliant pictures were taken by amateurs or whether a professional happened to be there, because some of the pictures have been absolutely superb. They kind of look as though they must be stills from the movie set, that someone has been there in Westminster. They're filming, they've got all the stars there, and there's the horses, and you've got these beautifully framed horses with the beautifully telegenic
dynamism,
tomato ketchup of the blood that's going down. It's clearly filmed, and it's not. You know, the horses are injured, people have been injured. I think that the human injuries were not very serious. But there's a very serious story here. But fundamentally, one of the best comments that I saw actually was saying, like, does the metaverse have to become this real? This is like just a couple of horses short of an apocalypse. We knew we were in an apocalypse, and it really does look like the apocalypse has run wild in central London. An extraordinary story.
4 horsemen taken of apocalypse taken to history, hospital, not with life-threatening injuries.
Exactly so.
Steve Crawshaw, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London, 7:32. A quick look now at the latest headlines. The US President Joe Biden has signed into law a package worth tens of billions of dollars in military aid for Ukraine. Mr. Biden said the US would send fresh weapons and equipment to Ukraine right away to help Kyiv defend itself against Russian advances. Meanwhile, Russia has vetoed a US-drafted United Nations Security Council resolution that called on countries to prevent an arms race in outer space. The move prompted the United States to question if Moscow was hiding something. The vote came after Washington accused Moscow of developing an anti-satellite nuclear weapon based in space. And the government in Slovakia has approved plans to abolish the country's state broadcaster, Radio and Television of Slovakia, and replace it with a new body, Slovak Television and Radio. The announcement has led to fears for the independence of the media under the populist nationalist coalition led by Prime Minister Robert Fico. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Let's continue now with some news that broke in the last 12 to 14 hours. The Spanish Prime Minister has announced he's to step back from public duties in response to an investigation into his wife's business. Pedro Sanchez said he'll spend a week deciding whether he wants to continue leading the government after a court launched a business corruption probe into his wife's private dealings. Well, Dr. Pablo Calderón Martínez is Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations at Northeastern University London. I'm delighted to say he joins me on the line now. Very good morning to you, Pablo.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
This is a totally unexpected story.
Yeah, it caught me by surprise. I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. We've heard some rumblings, and obviously, corruption scandals are not new in Spain. And also, it's not new to sort of throw mud and see what sticks in Spanish politics. But I think it's a very, very sad story and something that really put Spanish politics in a very bad light, I think.
I mean, just to explain to us what his wife is accused of doing and why it affects the Prime Minister.
I think the accusations are, in my view, a little bit spurious. They come from an organization, Manos Limpias, or Clean Hands, that is, well known to be a far-right organization, or links with the far right at the very least. And their claim is that his wife, Pedro Sanchez's wife, received some sort of favor, some sort of bribes. I'm not entirely sure what it was, from the airline Air Europa during the pandemic, when the airline was struggling to survive the pandemic. The government bailed them out and supported the airline, which many governments across the world did, across many airlines, and bailed them out. And the claim here is that somehow Pedro Sanchez's wife received some sort of favor from Air Europa around the time of the bailout. What truth is there in that? I have no idea.
And there is no indication that Sanchez himself may be involved in this?
There is no indication whatsoever. It seems to be all related to his wife's, Begoña Gómez, academic work and some funding the center she was running may have received. Again, to me, it sounds very spurious. It's from an organization that has a long track history of using judicial proceedings as leverage, right? As a matter of fact, the founder of such organization was convicted of fraud and using this organization as a way to leverage individuals. So, yeah, what truth there is in that, I have no idea, but I suspect is not going to lead to much.
What's been the reaction to Pedro Sanchez's decision to step back? Because there were reports yesterday after the news broke said that threatening to resign looked like a bit of a ploy. I mean, is there genuine support for him, and do you think he will resign?
I mean, I've always said that Pedro Sanchez, above anything else, is a very canny political operator, and he has a way of sort of reading things, and he takes these big risks that often pay off. I don't necessarily know if this is one of those ploys. I do generally think there must be a sense of exhaustion, right? I think he's been prime minister it's coming out to 6 years. He's had to survive general elections, right? Coalitions, a process of very much turmoil in Spanish politics. I'm sure there must be some sense of exhaustion as well. Spanish politics is incredibly polarized. So I'm not entirely sure this is just a ploy or a move by Pedro Sanchez to reinforce his position. It may be, and it may be that it turns out that it does elucidate some sort of massive outcry of public support. But I think there's some genuine feelings there of, he really is considering his position.
And if he does step down, what kind of political landscape would he leave?
Again, I think it'll be a very, very sad state of affairs. And I think it will just even exacerbate more the divisions that already exist in Spain. It would embolden certain sectors, particularly the far right, and obviously as well the far left, and it will lead more towards the polarization of Spanish politics. If anything, the reaction from the right to this recent story, particularly for the Partido Popular, has not been one of, showing some sort of support, or at least some sort of mercy, if you wish. But they lean more towards the far right. They're supporting this far right organization. So I think if he steps down, or whenever his term in office comes to an end, we will have an even more polarized Spanish political landscape. I
mean, when this, when you say if he steps down, when this comes to an end, is there a sense now that no matter what happens, this is the last chapter of Sanchez's term in office?
I mean, again, I wouldn't just discard him. I would never bet against Sanchez's political survival. I think he's proven over and over again that he is a survival expert, right? And he's a survivor in politics. There's no doubt about that. But at some point, everybody must say, this is it. This is enough. I don't know if Pedro Sanchez has reached that level quite yet. So I wouldn't say necessarily the last chapter, but I definitely wouldn't think he's going to be around for that much longer. He might want to see the end of this parliament. And then I think he'll probably hang up his boots, as it were.
Pablo Calderon Martinez, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
It's 8:39 in Zurich, 7:39 here in London. Now, a transitional council to govern Haiti has still not been sworn in. Earlier this week, the head of the UN children's agency UNICEF described the situation in the country as catastrophic and growing worse by the day as gangs continue to cause chaos. Armed groups are now reportedly in control of an estimated 90% of the capital, Port-au-Prince. So to bring us up to date, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Sabatini, Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House here in London. A very good morning to you, Chris.
Good morning, Emma.
So how far are we along the line to getting this transitional council?
It's still unclear. There's rumors that it will be sworn in today, Thursday, but an indication of how bad things have become. If they are sworn in, they're going to have to be sworn in at the Prime Minister's residence, which is outside Port-au-Prince, because the National Palace is pretty much under siege. It's been fired at. The troops, Haitian troops, had to disperse protesters and fire tear gas because there were being shots fired at the National Palace. So, even if it gets sworn in today, they still have to choose an interim prime minister. That will take some time. So we're still a ways off from this fully being seated and then clearly operational.
And once this council is up and running, who is on it who can make a difference?
Well, it's a broad array of more identified by the sectors that they represent than the individuals. You have representatives from a number of political parties. One has come under controversy for allegedly having ties to armed groups, but business groups are represented, civil society is represented. It is a broad coalition. There's, in some cases, especially among the political parties, which I guess is understandable, you have some of the usual suspects in terms of the political elite that have circulated in the corridors of power in Haiti for a long time now and partially have been responsible for this chaos. So it's there. It's a broad representation, but many people are complaining that it doesn't have enough women and it doesn't have enough civil society or grassroots representation.
One thing that has been a problem is the fact that gangs control so much of Haiti, especially Port-au-Prince. But what can their involvement be in trying to bring about stability?
Ideally, there should be none. The truth is that I think trying to develop some sort of modus vivendi with the gangs would be a disaster. These are gangs that are criminal. They're more in this year alone. In the first quarter of this year, more than 2,500 people have been killed. That's a 53% increase. That's blood in the hands of the gang leaders. They don't deserve to be in power. One of the problems is, first of all, you will have to, as you mentioned, you will have to take back that 90% of the Port-au-Prince that is under control of the gangs. Most of the routes out of Port-au-Prince are under control of the gangs. This is going to require, if the gangs are not going to be represented, and I repeat, I don't think they should be, it will require taking the country back from them, and that's not going to be easy.
Tell us a little bit more about the international repercussions of having Haiti in such a terrible situation, given the fact that often Haiti is seen as a country apart, which finds itself in desperate need a lot of the time. But if you have something as unstable as Haiti in that region, what is the international effect?
Well, I think, first of all, the demonstration of international paralysis to do anything meaningful in Haiti is really weakens the sense of resolve and efficacy of international institutions. A year and a half ago, they agreed to a form of humanitarian support in Haiti. The original idea was $674 million would be used to provide humanitarian support. Only 9% of that has been funded so far. And that was a year and a half ago, and very little of it has reached, and most of it that is arriving in Haiti is being siphoned off by the gangs. The second is October 2023, so I guess about 6 months ago, the UN Security Council agreed to mount a security force, a multilateral security force, to help install security in Haiti. That is still not landed. The government has been dissolved, and now we're waiting for a new government to be addressed. And then the last is the international community is already talking about this government, since it is an interim government, moving on to elections. But how those elections will be conducted, who would compete, how you can actually get the country running and the government sort of establishing enough security to do that, it seems quite premature to already be talking about elections. So it just seems, quite frankly, that the international community just looks weak and feckless. And
as a result, how much longer do you think it will take before Haiti gets any sort of semblance of control, given the fact that, as you say, you have weakness from the international community and a transitional council which still hasn't found its feet yet?
Geez, Emma, do I have to give an exact date when I think this will be ready?
Go on then. Not necessarily, Chris. A general estimation would be fine.
It will take a long time. Let me put it this way. I think it's too early to be talking about elections. I think we don't even have a multilateral force yet that can go in and secure security in Haiti. The ports where they would land many of them are still occupied. They had to suspend operations and deliveries through one of the ports. There's many of the big steps are yet to be taken. It took over a month now to establish this transitional council, and that's really just the first step.
Chris Sabatini, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Now to Strasbourg, where an exhibition has just opened at the European Parliament, challenging MEPs to have another look at the potential of people who've taken irregular routes of immigration. It's a display of fashion designed and modelled by residents of the International Organisation for Migration's reception centres in the Western Balkans. They have their own label, No Nation Fashion, and the photos in the exhibition are the work of fashion snapper cum war photographer Franco Pagetti. On Monocle's man in the Balkans, Guy Delaunay spoke to the IOM's Ugochi Daniels about the thinking behind the project.
My name is Ugochi Daniels, and I'm the Deputy Director General for Operations at the UN Migration Agency, IOM. It's born out of conditions, it's born out of opportunity, but it also speaks to the hope and the promise of migration. Started in 2021, making masks, and then transformed into making clothes, working with local designers, engaging with the community, demonstrating the potential of migrants and how they can contribute. It's grounded in truth and demonstrates how out of the tragedy of wars and all the things that force people to move, that we can still harness the full potential of migration.
You talk about the optimism of migration, which is interesting because frankly, if you look at the mainstream media a lot of the time, that doesn't come across.
Yes, we want to reduce people moving irregularly. We want to create more opportunities for people to move regularly. But let's recognize we wouldn't have recovery from COVID without migrants, right? The economic growth that countries in the global north are seeing, migrants have played a key contribution to that. Whatever we as the global community don't do to offer opportunities to move regularly, migrants are left with no option but to put their lives in the hands of a smuggler or a trafficker. And then we end up with the headlines that are horrible when it comes to irregular migration. It transitioned from sewing centers to creativity centers that brought in the community, particularly local designers. And what that then fostered is the social cohesion within communities and showing to the host communities the contributions that migrants are making in their societies. In this case, fashion was such a good example because everybody somehow is connected with fashion, either at the low end or at the high end, right?
My case, probably more towards the low end, but do you need to be qualified to take part in this? Are they already connected with fashion somehow, or is this something that the program has introduced them to, a new quality that it's brought out of people who didn't necessarily know that they might have had it?
I think it's a bit of both. And migrants expressing what it is they wanted to do and skills that they wanted to acquire, which is where the local artists come in. Our centers offer this space for them to engage in no nation fashion. What is really striking to me, and I see it time and time again, is that, yes, the conditions of the movement and what triggered them moving can be very harrowing and very traumatic. The aspirations across the board, across geographies, are the same. Wanting to be productive, wanting to have freedoms, wanting to have opportunities, and wanting to have the skills to contribute, and showing to their host communities that what they bring is positive. Here we're spotlighting individual stories and achievements in fashion. These could be achievements in technology, they could be achievements in construction, they could be achievements in agriculture. It could be a whole range of sectors. And we want to use this to inspire, the cultural dialogue, mutual understanding between migrants and their local communities. More broadly, and this is really important at where I am at the European Parliament, is we want to catalyze discussions on more inclusive migration governance frameworks.
Is this conceptual, or is it actually something that we can see and buy and wear?
Well, absolutely, we can see, buy, and wear. When I was in Sarajevo, I got a beautiful green dress, which I happened to be wearing to my daughter's wedding in London in October. They featured at New York Fashion Week as well. Obviously, they're on social media. So at the individual level, it's a case study, it's a story, it's also an industry brand. It's also the much larger story of what this represents for many, many migrants who are on the move today.
And that's the IOM's Ugochi Daniels talking to Monocle's Guy Delaunay about the No Nation Fashion Project. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. .45 here in London. Time to talk business now with Isabel Hamilton, senior reporter at the Daily Upside, who joins us on the line now. Very good morning, Isabel.
Good morning.
So just tell us what the headlines on the front page of the Financial Times this morning is that Meta's shares are tumbling and Mark Zuckerberg has had to step up to defend it.
Yes. So Meta's had a really good year in terms of their stock, and that sort of changed because even though their earnings beat estimates yesterday, they revealed that they are raising their full year capital expenditure, bumping it up by about $3 billion from $37 billion to $40 billion, because Mark Zuckerberg wants to pour loads of money into AI and becoming a very dominant AI company. This is on top of all of the spending they're doing to do with the metaverse still. That's kind of gone out of the public consciousness a bit, but it is still pouring absolutely mountains of cash into this very sort of blue sky effort. And the news that they were going to pour even more money into AI now on top of that showed the investors, didn't really vibe with it.
When an investor doesn't vibe with it, it can cause quite catastrophic results for the share price. I mean, how does Mark Zuckerberg square this circle? Because clearly his ambitions are clear and his intentions are clear, but obviously he needs to listen to his backers.
Yes, the stock fell about 19%, I believe, but he doesn't seem too bothered by it. He said that it's quite normal for some volatility when the company is plugging lots of money into a product that hasn't really come to bear yet. He said that this happened with short video services like Reels, and he's not too bothered, to be honest.
Okay, good for him. Let's look at Octopus Energy. They're investing, aren't they?
Yeah, so Octopus is investing reportedly somewhere between $10 and $30 million, according to the Wall Street Journal, into a American wind turbine company that specializes in getting them produced by working with manufacturers near where they're going to be placed. And this is interesting because last year was a terrible year for wind energy. It ran into this huge financing crisis. People were pulling money out of it rather than putting it in. But the one sort of bright spot that people were looking forward to was floating wind turbines.
It's an interesting idea as well, because Octopus is European based and it is investing in an American company.
Yeah, but American wind energy has attracted quite a bit of European investment in the past. Ørsted, which is a really big energy company, poured loads of investment into America, although it did sort of become skittish last year in that period I was talking about where the financing became really difficult.
Let's move on to another story about... we've been talking about this, we've touched on this a couple of times over the programme today. The bill that was passed in the United States and signed into law yesterday by Joe Biden not only gave an awful lot of military aid to the likes of Ukraine, and humanitarian aid to Israel, and also support to Taiwan, it also snuck in a ban on, or a potential ban on, TikTok. And this is an astonishing story, given the fact that it's an American, a nation taking action against a private company. And if a private company is affected by this, if TikTok is banned, it will make a lot of Americans very cross.
Yeah, and not just Americans. So there's a piece in the BBC today about small business owners in the UK who said this is going to be absolutely devastating if it goes through, because lots of small businesses in the UK make sales through TikTok and specifically do quite well selling to Americans on TikTok. And there was one person who said that some months, 60, even 70% of his sales come from US TikTok sales, because TikTok isn't really purely social media anymore. It's got this big growing international commerce side to it. So when in a country like America takes this action that's sort of touted as being fairly domestic and to do with national security, it really isn't constrained to America.
Isabel Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're with The Globalist. Finally today, Spanish language music has been having a moment for quite some time, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. A new review from the Recording Industry Association of America this week says Latin music has a market share of 7.9% of all recorded music revenue in the US last year. Our Monocle's senior correspondent Fernanda Augusta Pacheco sat down with our head of radio, Tom Edwards, to talk about the rise of Latin music worldwide and the top artists we should be looking out for.
Rather than shine a spotlight on a particular country or market, we're sort of zooming out, a big picture. Really interesting reports this week about the state of Latin music generally. Huge year, record revenues. Give us a snapshot. Why is the moment now for this sector?
First of all, Tony, it is remarkable, the numbers. So the latest music report about Latin music, especially in the United States, came out this week. And the numbers are incredible. $1.4 billion, which is up 16% from the previous year. And up 24% just in the last 2 years. So this is a topic we've been talking about. Oh, people are listening more to Latin music, reggaeton, all those artists. But the numbers were still, let's be honest, fairly niche, especially in countries that are not naturally Spanish-speaking. But this is changing. Earlier this year, I went to the World Music Report here, an event that happened every year in London. And I was looking at the top 10 artists. I don't think Latin artist was ever there in the top 10, but this year we had Bad Bunny. So those artists, they are entering kind of the music conscience around the world, especially in the United States. I mean, we got to give credit to the country. The Hispanic community there is very strong, and even non-Hispanics are listening to this type of music.
Now, Faye, I guess one of the key factors here, presumably, must be, we know, the ongoing or continuing decline of physical retail, record CDs and so forth. Streaming continues to be the way people access their music. And indeed, that must be a key driver. I guess the accessibility question is met. Maybe it was a little more difficult to find out what the trends were, or then to get your hands on the music from artists who were breaking out. Now everything's there, right? I mean, that presumably is why we're seeing this explosive growth.
Absolutely. And I think in Latin music in particular, of course, we see the vinyl growth and even CD growth these days. But Latin music, it's almost 100% streaming. I don't know exactly the specific reasons, but as you rightly said, accessibility. And Latin America is one of the fastest growing music markets in the world. There's been a rise of 20%. It's incredible. It's very fast paced. And perhaps because it is expensive to buy vinyl, it is expensive to buy CD, but the streaming services are becoming more available as well. And let's look, the most popular languages worldwide. English is still strong, 54%, but only 2 years ago, Tom, it was 67%. And I'm talking here about the whole world. And Spanish is a very strong second with 10%, and I predict this number might grow in the coming years as well.
Fernando, I'm always interested at what happens at the intersections of music and culture and fashion and publishing, all these things that coalesce around one another. Presumably, there's an incredible opportunity here as Latin music takes root and influences a critical market like the US, which remains, of course, the biggest market, to, offer further expression culturally, more broadly. Are we at an inflection point for the Latin influence, if you like? We know the figures. I think the US is heading in the direction of being a sort of, majority Spanish-speaking, whatever it is. I can never remember the exact details. But is there a cultural moment to go with the music moment?
Absolutely. And the artists, which I find interesting, there are no concessions here. When you look at Bad Bunny, which is the most popular Latin artist of the moment, he sings in Spanish. He is number one in the United States in the main charts in a fully Spanish album. So in the past, there's been some presence of Latin music in the US before and in Europe, but it was kind of Spanglish. You have Ricky Martin living La Vida Loca, or...
I sadly remember that all too well.
Which I love it, to be honest, or Shakira, whenever. But now they sing in Spanish. You have Karol G, Peso Pluma, and it's not only reggaeton, Tom. We have regional Mexican music with groups like Grupo Frontera. Very regional, but they're doing so well. And again, not just in Mexico or the United States. You could hear that in Europe as well. So it is very remarkable what's happening there.
Do you ever worry a little bit, Fernando, that we're just always one step away from some cynic saying, let's get some Latin flavour into the mix, or let's add some more, Latin accents or some Mexican beats, because that's kind of what the public want at the moment. We don't want to see that happening. Are you confident that not only is the trend, it's not a trend, it's here to stay, but that we won't see that kind of the sort of affectation which everyone finds a bit annoying?
I don't think so, Tom, because I think the growth has been fairly organic, thanks to the fans and to the music industry of the Spanish-speaking countries as well, because even the Spanish-speaking countries, they are consuming more of their own music. And I'm talking here a lot about Latin America, but I'll give you an interesting stat. In the music market in Spain, there's been a huge rise of people listening to songs in Spanish. Now it's 62% of the whole market. I think that's been a record year. So I think even in the countries that speak Spanish, they're listening more to their own language as well. So that's fairly interesting.
While you're here, to pick your brain in this sort of global countdown style, I remember you told me about some of these trends with the sort of Mexican folk heritage scene. This must have been at least a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. I remember that conversation, and obviously these things are coming to pass. Is there a specific market, though, Faye, where we could see more influence, more exciting acts emerging? You've got your finger obviously on the pulse here. Where could we go? It could be a teeny market, tiny percentage of a percentage, but one that we should be watching as a kind of exemplar, as a benchmark that's showing this growth. Where should we be watching?
Well, I think a country that we might be seeing quite a lot in the next years, it's Argentina. I think they have a very strong hip-hop scene and also Latin pop artists. You have someone like Bizarrap who sang a song with Shakira and he was doing very well. So, we had Colombia, we had Mexico. I think Argentina, keep an eye on Argentina.
And that was Fernanda Augusta Pacheco there talking to Tom Edwards. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests. And thanks to our producers, Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Monica Lillis. Our research was George Ruskin and our studio manager, Christy O'Grady, with editing assistance from Flint Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.